Hey guys, hope you're having a good start of the week. This week we'll be talking about teaching argumentative writing. Chapter 1. Who done it? Students often tend to see no reason to present evidence or show why it is relevant, they merely express opinion. However, Common Core standards state that students beginning in middle school should be able to write arguments to support claims with clear reasons and relevant evidence. Helix uses a Tolman module to help students learn to develop arguments from existing data. If we start with a problem, students learn the strategy for making arguments such as analyzing evidence critically in light of existing knowledge, interpreting the evidence to explain what it shows, developing warrants that show why the evidence is relevant, and using the evidence and the explanations to solve the problem. Introducing the problem. Helix introduces his students to a crime scene picture describing the scene slip or trip and asks if they believe the witness report from the victim's wives. Students were first asked to gather evidence from the crime scene. When students collected their evidence, they were then asked to create rules based off this evidence. Afterwards, they were told then to write their conclusions or claims. For example, one evidence they found is the victim had a glass cup on his hand when found dead. As a rule, they came up with when people fall downstairs, they drop what they are carrying to save themselves, and that's a pretty sound argument. Based off that and the witness report, they made a claim. Wife is probably lying about his falling down the stairs since she claimed that he fell down the stairs. Reviewing evidence and writing general rules and writing a report. At this point, Nahalik asked the rest of the class to go over and revise evidence and rules that have already been determined while trying to add new ones. The entire time, the teacher allowed for students to work together in groups or with the whole class. One thing to point out is he never really gave the answers. He guided students into trying to interpret the evidence and use the evidence that is present to support their claim without ever really giving them the answer how to exactly interpret the question. The evidence, my apologies. And based off the skills that developed, then he makes a judgment call on moving students towards independence. When learners reach a level of proficiency, it's time to increase the difficulty of the work and provide less support. Withdraw support too soon and they become frustrated. Maintain support too long and they become bored. It's a judgment call. And you see this with the later activities he has planned. They become more difficult, and he then determines whether the kids should do it independently or whether they should stay within small groups. It is a judgment call. Discussion question number 1. Have you ever used a crime scene as a means of developing your argumentative writing skills? If so, was it effective at the time in teaching you how to look at evidence and develop claims based on them? Why or why not? Chapter 2. What makes a good mascot or a good leader? Common Core standards dictate that by ninth grade, students should write arguments to support claims and analysis of a substantive topics using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. One way to promote this is using the proper mascot activity. The goals were to develop a module of informal reasoning, use a module for informal reasoning to analyze data and draw logical conclusions, apply a module for informal reasoning in writing an analysis of a problem that requires the application of criteria in judging the relative merits of a set proposed school mascot. The proper mascot name activity. Here are the steps for it. Step 1, introduce the activity. Take note of something about your own school mascot. Step 2, ask students about their own school mascots and record their answers on the board or on chart paper. And now here's some questions that they need to consider about their own mascot. How do you feel about it? Do you like it? Why or why not? What comes to mind when you think of it? How was the mascot selected? If you were to select a different mascot, what would it be? Why would you select it? Step 3. Project images of other school mascots for students to consider, aka project school logos. Step 4. Ask students to evaluate the merits of each mascot. Do you think the mascot is a good one? Is it bad? If you like it, what makes it a good mascot? If you don't like it, what makes it a bad mascot? Step 5. Ask students to think about the class discussion they just had and make a list of criteria for what they think makes a good mascot. Step 6. When they have finished their list, ask students to express their assessment in a whole class discussion. Record students' thoughts on the board so that students can refer back to this list later. They will need it. Step 7. Divide students into a group of 3 or 4. Tell them their task is to propose 4 or 5 rules or warrants a school could use as criteria to guide the selection of a mascot. Give examples of verb to use. A mascot should be, ought to be, need to be, etc. Step 8. Call on representatives from each group to report their rules or criteria in the form of warrants for selecting a mascot. Step 9. Through a process of paraphrasing, clarifying, and evaluating those rules or warrants, the class agrees on a common set of criteria for judging a good mascot. Step 10. Tell your students they will use the class criteria to help a new school select a mascot. Step 11. Students identify the attributes of each finalist. How do the finalist features of each finalist match the rules or criteria you have proposed for selecting a good mascot? Step 12. Use a mascot of your own school to module process of composing an argument of judgment. Basically make the comparison between the two. Step number 13. Students compose their own arguments of judgment. Tell students they must select one of the finalist mascots and explain it in a thorough, logical paragraph why it would be a good mascot for the new school. So basically, you're taking the general rules you came up with of what makes a good mascot, the original conclusion you made about your own mascot, whether it was good or bad, and based off the conclusion you had for that, based off the general rules you created for, in general, what makes a good mascot, you then propose to this new school out of the finalists which one best fits the criteria of what is a good mascot based off the general rules you came up with the whole class. Another activity that was done is a picture is worth 1,000 words. Step 1. Distribute copies of the voluptuary and ask students what they think of the man. Now, the picture itself is just the picture of the Prince of Wales, and he's sitting down eating, and there's it's not a pretty sight. Let's just say that, and people will gather evidence in that picture. Step number 2, ask the students to define voluptuary and write why the man in this picture might be labeled as one. And there is plenty of evidence in that picture of why it is. For example, um, the coat of arms of the knife and fork that you see, definitely a sign of voluptuary and is gluttony. Step number 3, ask students what makes a good king and encourage them to justify their responses. Record their thinking, and at the end of your class discussion, you should have a list of criteria in response to this question. Step number 4, work with the class to apply one of their criteria to a prince pictured in the voluptuary. Record their thinking on a chart under the headings claim, evidence, and warrants. Step 5, put students in groups of 3 or 4 to ask them to work with the remaining criteria established by the class. Step number 6, students write an argument of judgment. What I really like about this particular exercise is that it's actually a really good way of proposing or um, teaching historical facts and arguments. For example, here, just with this one picture, you have a good understanding of whether the Prince of Wales, who will later be king, whether he was actually a good king or not. Um, and throughout the picture, you see such as um, he's a man who indulges in his own pleasures. He is bad with money because there's a whole bunch of different receipts in the picture showing that there's a great amount of debt, um, and he clearly doesn't take care of himself very well. So all and it gives a good impression of the kind of king that existed around that time, the problems society may have had, that particular kingdom may have had at the time, and it's more interesting. It makes it a lot more interesting to learn. Discussion question: what are some benefits of using these kinds of exercises for students? What are some potential flaws, specifically with these two?
Chapter 3, Solving Problems Kids Care About. So, an argument of policy is a great way to teach students how to write arguments with something that they actually care about. You're going to avoid policy that doesn't really affect the students. When they argue for policy that doesn't affect them, they tend to just find information on the internet, summarize other people's arguments using other people's data, And they can also bring their own opinions to the class if the argument is based on something they've done in a different class. Common ones that teachers like to use are abortion, death penalty, cloning, these kind of big societal questions that don't really affect the student. Using a unique policy that matters to the student will encourage them to create their own ideas, their argument, and their research, which is why using a school policy is great for the students because it actually affects them. So your first step of doing this is you're going to identify and clarify the problem. You're going to find a policy that impacts the student at the school. This should elicit a very strong response, either for it or against it. And it needs to be researchable so that the students can actually create their own data to use and their own evidence to back up their claims. So the last thing is you're going to want to create a list of questions that have to be answered about the policy. This is something that you're going to work on with the students, and this is going to be kind of your guiding path for the rest of the argument. So your second step, you're going to want to plan how you're going to investigate. So you're going to ask the students how to answer the questions created. You're going to want to create a plan for how to answer each one of these questions. It's best if the students come up with it, but of course, as the teacher, you can help it along, ask leading questions if the students can't figure it out. Some possible methods for this is internet research, interviews, questionnaires, counting objects. Like for counting objects, they counted amount of gum underneath tables and chairs in the school for the book. They interviewed the principal, the janitor. They gave questionnaires to students, stuff like that. So step 3, you're going to conduct the investigation. You're going to want to split the students into groups and conduct the investigations created in step 2. You're going to want groups of at least 2, no more than 4, because people kind of get in the way of each other. So after all this information has been collected, you're going to help the students analyze it because they may not understand everything that's involved in it. And you're going to want to report all the information to the class so the whole class knows what's going on. So the fourth step is you're going to introduce your argument. This is your big final paper, and the rest of the steps are going to break down how you create this argument. So the first part, you're going to make an introduction where the nature of the problem and the major questions are explained. You're going to explain how the investigation is carried out next. And then you're going to want to explain your results, what they mean, and why they're actually valid. And lastly, you're going to want to explain what might be reasonably done based on what you found. So in step 5, you're going to write the introduction. You're going to want to model this writing with a student input. As a teacher, you're in front of the class on like an overhead projector or a smart board writing it, asking them questions and kind of working on it together. So you're going to want to start with the reason for the study. In the book, this was because they disagreed with the ban on gum. And then you're going to write down what the study wanted to find out. In the book, this was, is gum really a problem in the school, and does the ban work? So for this, you're going to want to use formal writing in this because you want to treat this as a real attempt to investigate a policy. You should feel like you can hand this argument to whoever's in charge and feel like they may actually consider changing their opinion. Using words like estimate instead of find out, examine also works well for find out, and using formal language. So in step 6, you're going to present, interpret, and explain your findings. You're going to make sure you report all your findings honestly, even if it contradicts seemingly the point that you're trying to make. Any argument you make should be based on the facts that you found. You're going to want to explain what the findings mean, because just having a bunch of statistics and a bunch of information doesn't really mean much. You're going to explain why these things happen, stuff like that. In the book, they found that 95% of students said that the students believe other students put gum under the desk to avoid the ban, but only 8% said they themselves do it. So you have to explain why there's this discrepancy, you think. And you give possible explanations for why the students found what they did, and that ties into explaining the findings. So in step 7, you're going to write about the research design and methods. You're going to explain how the investigation was carried out. You want to explain how the data was collected, if you used a questionnaire, what kind of questions, how could they answer, if you use interviews, who did you interview, that kind of stuff. So then in step 8, you're going to write about your results, and then you're going to interpret them. You're going to use the data collected to answer the questions created in step 1, and adding in the interpretations from step 6. Basically, you're going to take each question, and you're going to answer it using the argument of this is what we found, and that's how it answers this question. So the final step, step 9, you're going to write the conclusion and the recommendations. You're going to explain what the results of the investigation mean for the policy. You're going to give recommendations for how the governing body can change the policy and any additional information that is important to the investigation. So in the book, they gave the conclusion that there was a lot of gum, that the gum posed a health problem, which is additional information they added. And they gave the recommendations that lifting the ban on gum would actually help because they feel that their data showed that students put gum underneath the desks because of the ban, and they also recommended that the school put up signs that show that their or that show that students need to throw out their gum instead of. So there's some benefits to using policy in action to teach students how to create arguments. So the first one is there's a lot of close collaborations and repetition. So this lesson involves a lot of students and teachers working together to figure out how the problem should be solved, what kind of evidence needs to be gathered, and how that evidence should be gathered. And you can also use this again, in smaller groups, smaller projects, but it'll still use the exact same steps so the students can become even more familiar with them. Students also learn the basic strategies of how to understand a problem they're going to be writing about because they need to figure out the evidence that they need to gather. They need to figure out how they're going to gather it, what that evidence means, and how to use that evidence to support what they think. So students develop the 3 basic types of arguments. There's fact, which is the evidence that they gather, the judgment, which is what that evidence means and how the students feel that that affects their argument, and then of course policy, which is the whole thing, and the whole point of this is to try to argue about a policy. So lastly, students also learn the 3 major strategies of rhetoric, which is pathos, ethos, and logos. So pathos is your credibility. This is done in the book by conceding that there was way too much gum and something has to be done about how much gum is underneath the tables and chairs in the school. Your ethos is your appeal to emotion, and the emotion for this is one of rationality because it's using a rational argument based on fact. And logos is just the logic of your argument because any argument you make needs to have logic in it, and this is also done with the evidence that was gathered. So the discussion question for this chapter is: what are some school policies for your time in school that you wish you could have created an argument about? And how would you have your class investigate this policy? So some key features to teaching argumentative writing that go through all 3 of these different types of lessons are: the first one is the lesson needs to be interactive. You don't want your students just sitting there and watching you or listening to you kind of teach to them. You want them to be a big part of this. Creating an argument involves a lot of thinking and working through things. So the students need to be involved at least in a class discussion, preferably going and doing stuff, looking at a picture, conducting interviews, stuff like that. You're going to want to start with a problem that needs to be solved. Starting with a problem helps the students to start to think of how they're going to make an argument, and that will kind of give them the path about what they should be thinking about as they work through all of the different steps in the lesson. So the solution to the problem has to be based on evidence. The whole point of teaching argumentative writing is to teach students how to back up what they're trying to argue with solid evidence. And so whatever problem that you're using to teach this needs to have evidence that they can use to back up. So the evidence needs to be used to create a rule. Evidence by itself doesn't really mean much. Noticing that the guy at the bottom of the stairs in the murder mystery photo had a cup in his hand doesn't mean anything, but when you take that a step further and create a rule out of it, that when you trip down the stairs, you drop whatever is in your hand, that can actually be used to back up an argument. So the lesson should also be conducted in the following steps. You're going to start with the problem. Then you're going to want to move to evidence gathering. So after you have the evidence, you're going to want to move to evidence interpretation. This is where you create your rules or your warrants. And then finally, you're going to have your conclusion where you back up your argument and you state, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it. So the final discussion question is, what are some other types of class activities that could teach students the core concepts of argumentative writing?